Number 1. Paul Flores. For 25 years, Paul Flores walked free. He went to the grocery store, drove down familiar roads, lived what appeared to be an ordinary life. All while, the family of Kristen Smart spent a quarter of a century grieving a daughter who had simply vanished into the California night. What makes this case one of the most haunting in modern true crime history isn't just that it went unsolved for so long. It's that the answer, as investigators would eventually discover, was never far from where it all began. Kristen Denise Smart was born on February 20th, 1977 in Augsburg, Bavaria, to parents Stan and Denise Smart, both teachers who served American military families abroad. By the time Kristen was a child, the family had settled in Stockton, California, and where she grew into someone her brother Matt later described as an artist, an adventurer, an individual who was just full of life. She graduated from Lincoln High School in 1995 and enrolled at California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo, Cal Poly, that same fall. She worked as a lifeguard and camp counselor. She called home every Sunday without fail. She was finding her footing, experimenting with independence the way many freshmen do. At parties, she sometimes went by a playful nickname, Roxy. It was, as a friend put it, just an alter ego. She wanted to have fun. On the evening of Friday, May 24th, 1996, Memorial Day weekend, Kristen attended an off-campus party. She didn't know anyone there, but that wasn't unusual for someone still building her social circle. As the night wore on, she had been drinking. But around 2 a.m. on May 25th, two fellow students, Cheryl Anderson and Tim Davis, found Kristen passed out on a neighbor's lawn and helped her to her feet. They began walking her back toward her dormitory near her hall. That's when a third student joined them, a young man named Paul Flores. He was a freshman from Arroyo Grande, California. He lived closer to Kristen's dorm, he said, and he offered to take it from there. The other two students said goodnight and went their separate ways. Paul Flores and Kristen Smart continued walking. Kristen Smart was never seen again. 2 days later, Paul Flores walked into the Arroyo Grande Police Department for an unrelated matter, an outstanding DUI warrant. Something stood out in his booking photograph. He had a fresh black eye. When investigators asked how he got it, Flores offered 3 completely different explanations. No one pressed him further at the time. Campus police, meanwhile, were not treating this as urgent. An early incident report filed after Kristen disappeared described her in terms that implied she was simply off somewhere of her own free will, noting that she had been drinking and socializing with multiple people at the party. Her family was devastated by the suggestion. Her parents hired an attorney and filed a civil lawsuit against Flores. When he was deposed in 1997, he answered exactly one question, confirming his name, and then invoked the Fifth Amendment 27 consecutive times. Investigators circled Flores for years. Trained cadaver dogs were brought into his dormitory room at Cal Poly and reacted with alerts. A woman renting a home connected to his family found a single earring that appeared to match jewelry Kristen had been wearing. But the evidence was lost before it could be properly cataloged. The investigation stalled, reopened, stalled again. For over 2 decades, Flores remained a suspect, but a free one. Then, in 2018, a musician named Chris Lambert launched a podcast called Your Own Backyard, retracing every detail of Kristen's disappearance. Lambert was only 8 years old when she vanished. He'd grown up seeing her face on roadside billboards. The podcast drew millions of listeners, including the sitting San Luis Obispo County Sheriff, Ian Parkinson, who made a public promise to the Smart family. He would not stop. In March 2021, investigators executed a search at the home of Ruben Flores, Paul's father, in Arroyo Grande. Beneath the deck in the backyard, they found biological evidence consistent with human remains having been buried and later removed. On April 13, 2021, nearly 25 years to the day after Kristen disappeared, Paul Flores was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. His father, Ruben, was charged as an accessory after the fact. The trial began July 18, 2022, held in Monterey County after a judge approved a change of venue. Prosecutors argued that Paul had killed Kristen during an attempted assault, and they presented testimony from 2 additional women who said Flores had drugged them and committed acts against them without their consent in the years following Kristen's death. Evidence of a disturbing pattern. The defense called the prosecution's forensic evidence junk science. and insisted the case was built on speculation. Yet at one point, defense attorney Robert Sanger attempted to suggest another Cal Poly area student might have been responsible, noting that Scott Peterson, later convicted of murdering his wife, had been enrolled at a nearby campus. It was a desperate pivot. On October 18, 2022, the jury returned its verdict. Paul Flores, guilty of first-degree murder. On March 10, 2023, Judge Jennifer O'Keefe sentenced him to 25 years to life in state prison, calling him, in open court, a cancer to society. Ruben Flores was acquitted on the accessory charge. Kristen Smart's remains have never been recovered. The Kristen Smart Campus Security Act now requires California's public colleges to take missing student reports seriously from the very first hour. A law written in her name for every student who deserves better than silence. 25 years of waiting ended in a Monterey County courtroom, but the next case on our list proves that sometimes justice doesn't wait for a trial at all, because the crimes were so monstrous, so documented, and so undeniable that a nation demanded answers long before the gavel ever fell. Number 2. Pearl Fernandez and Izaro Aguirre. Gabriel Fernandez went to school every day with a smile on his face and love in his heart for the people around him. His first-grade teacher, Jennifer Garcia, later told a courtroom that he was the kind of child who liked to help his classmates, who radiated warmth even when the world around him gave him very little reason to. That detail matters, because for the final 8 months of his life, that same child was living inside a nightmare that multiple adults had the power to stop. Yes, and not one of them did. Gabriel Daniel Fernandez was born on February 20th, 2005, in Palmdale, California. Almost from the very beginning, his life was marked by instability. Shortly after his birth, he was placed in the care of his great-uncle, Michael Lemos Carranza, and Carranza's partner, David Martinez. By most accounts, those were stable, loving years. Gabriel was fed, he was safe, and he was cared for. Then, in the autumn of 2012, when Gabriel was 7 years old, his mother, Pearl Fernandez, came back into the picture. She wanted custody, and the system handed him over. Pearl Fernandez had a history of her own struggles, but what the system may not have fully weighed was who she had recently brought into her life. His name was Izaro Aguirre, known to some as Tony, and he had a varied work history that painted two completely contradictory pictures of the same man. He had worked for years at a retirement home in Palmdale, where his supervisor would later describe him in court as gentle and kind, someone the elderly residents adored. Staff gave him a friendly nickname. He changed diapers for people who couldn't care for themselves. By late 2012, he was working as a security guard at a local grocery market. He seemed, by every outward indication, like an ordinary person. But inside the small home on East Avenue Q10 in Palmdale, something profoundly different was happening. From the very first weeks that Gabriel came to live with Pearl and Izaro, the abuse began, and it escalated with terrifying speed. Gabriel's teacher, Jennifer Garcia, noticed the signs almost immediately: bruises, injuries, a child who flinched. She called the child the welfare hotline. Then she called again, and again. Each time she was told a caseworker would look into it. No medical assessments were ever conducted. Social workers who visited the home spoke only with Pearl Fernandez. They never sat alone with Gabriel, never once asked the child directly what was happening behind closed doors. Meanwhile, the abuse documented in court records was staggering in its cruelty. Gabriel was beaten regularly. He was shot with a BB gun. He was burned. He was forced to sleep in a small cabinet, sometimes bound and gagged, while his mother and her boyfriend reportedly laughed nearby. And the prosecutors would later argue that one of Aguirre's motivations was a belief that Gabriel was gay, and that he was determined to punish the child for it. About 3 weeks before the end, a security guard at the Department of Public Social Services in Palmdale saw Gabriel walk in with his mother. He immediately noticed the injuries, the burns on the back of the boy's head, some fresh, some healing, bruises across his body, marks that should have triggered an immediate emergency response. The guard tried to report it. His supervisors told him not to, reportedly to avoid overtime. He eventually reached the sheriff's department, who said they would send someone. No one came. On the evening of May 22, 2013, Pearl Fernandez called 911. She said her son wasn't breathing. When paramedics arrived at the home, they found 8-year-old Gabriel naked on the floor, with injuries so severe they were difficult to process. A cracked skull, broken ribs, BB pellets lodged in his body, and signs of profound malnutrition. He was rushed to Antelope Valley Hospital, where doctors declared him brain dead. 2 days later, on May 24, 2013, his body having endured what no child should ever endure, Gabriel Fernandez died at Children's Hospital, Los Angeles. He was 8 years old. Pearl Fernandez and Isauro Aguirre were arrested the very next day and initially charged with abuse and attempted murder. Once Gabriel died, those charges were upgraded to first-degree murder with the special circumstance of intentional murder by torture. The case unraveled with devastating thoroughness, and Gabriel's own sibling testified about the daily reality inside that home. The beatings, the pepper spray aimed at Gabriel's face, the belt buckle, the metal hanger, the forced consumption of things no human being should be made to consume. The testimony was unbearable, and yet, threading through every day of that trial was an equally disturbing question. How did the system fail this child so completely? In 2016, 4 social workers and 2 supervisors were criminally charged with child abuse and falsifying public records. All of them were fired from the Department of Children and Family Services. That part of the story, the institutional failure, the bureaucratic indifference, became the backbone of Netflix's 2026-part documentary series, The Trials of Gabriel Fernandez, which brought the case to a global audience and reignited demands for reform. The charges against the social workers were ultimately dismissed on appeal, a decision that left many feeling that accountability had only gone so far. Inside the courtroom, the 2 defendants took very different paths. In November 2017, after a trial that lasted weeks, a jury found Isauro Aguirre guilty of first-degree murder with the special circumstance of intentional murder by torture, and recommended the death penalty. Pearl Fernandez, facing the same potential sentence, entered a guilty plea in February 2018, admitting to first-degree murder and the torture allegation. In court, she stated that she was sorry, that she wished Gabriel was alive, and that every day she wished she had made different choices. The judge, who had presided over the entire case, was not moved toward leniency. On June 7, 2018, both were sentenced. Pearl Fernandez received life in prison without the possibility of parole. She is currently held at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. Isauro Aguirre was sentenced to death and currently sits on death row at San Quentin State Prison. He has appealed his conviction, and those proceedings remain ongoing. A later attempt by Pearl Fernandez to have her sentence reconsidered was rejected outright by Judge George Lomelli, who stated plainly that the record of this case established intentional, prolonged torture of a child victim, and that no change in law could undo that reality. Gabriel's case changed California. New legislation was passed to overhaul how the state's child welfare system handles abuse reports, mandates medical follow-up, and tracks children across county lines. It was reform paid for at an unthinkable price. His first-grade teacher, Jennifer Garcia, the woman who called that hotline again and again and could not make anyone listen, said in court that Gabriel's abuse and death would haunt her for the rest of her life. She also said that if Gabriel had survived, he wouldn't have wanted anyone punished, because that, she said, was the kind of person he was. The next case takes us from the failures of a broken system to the terror of a single night. A bedroom window, a stranger, and a 12-year-old girl who simply wanted to have a sleepover with her friends. Number 3, Richard Allen Davis. The system had released him. Twice before, Richard Allen Davis had kidnapped women at knife point. Twice before, the courts had processed him, sentenced him, and eventually set him free. On the night of October 1st, 1993, he was on parole, walking free in the state of California with a criminal record that stretched nearly 2 decades. And on that night, in a quiet neighborhood in Petaluma, a 12-year-old girl named Polly Kloss was having a sleepover with her best friends. She had no idea the world was about to change forever. Richard Allen Davis was born on June 2, 1954, in San Francisco. His early years were marked by instability, a fractured home, a father who moved the family repeatedly, and little in the way of consistent structure or oversight. By his teenage years, Davis had already begun accumulating brushes with the law. What followed was not a gradual drift toward criminality, but an accelerating pattern with a clear trajectory. In 1976, Inahi was convicted of kidnapping and assaulting a woman and sentenced to prison. He served his time and was released. In the years that followed, he was convicted again. Robbery, burglary, assault, another kidnapping. Each time the justice system cycled through him and sent him back into the world. By the fall of 1993, Davis was 49 years old, on parole, and described by those who encountered him as erratic and volatile. Polly Hannah Kloss was, by every account, a luminous child. She was 12 years old, dark-haired, and dimpled. A girl who loved theater, creativity, and her friends. She lived with her mother, Eve Nichols, in Petaluma, a close-knit Northern California town about 40 miles north of San Francisco. On the evening of Friday, October 1st, 1993, Polly and two close friends gathered for a slumber party. Her mother slept in a nearby room. It was an ordinary Friday night in an ordinary American home. Around 10:30 p.m., Richard Allen Davis entered through an unlocked door. He was intoxicated and carrying a knife he had taken from the Kloss family's own kitchen. He moved through the house, located the bedroom where the three girls were, and stepped inside. Records indicate he told the children he was only there for money and that he meant them no harm. He tied Polly's two friends up and pulled pillowcases over their heads, instructing them to count to 1,000 and not move. Then he took Polly and walked out into the night. Within 30 minutes, an all-points bulletin was broadcast across Sonoma County. Within hours, a babysitter driving home spotted a suspicious vehicle stuck in a ditch on a private rural driveway outside Santa Rosa, about 20 miles from Petaluma. She contacted the property owner, who called authorities. Two sheriff's deputies arrived and encountered Davis standing beside the stuck car. Davis told them he had pulled over to relieve himself. The deputies ran his name, found no outstanding warrants at the time, filled out a routine field identification card, and let him go. Polly Kloss was, records later confirmed, already deceased, concealed in the thick brush on the hillside above where the car had been sitting. The deputies had been within feet of her. Back in Petaluma, Polly's friends were eventually able to free themselves and alert her mother. By morning, the case had exploded into national headlines. The face of Polly Kloss appeared on television screens and in newspapers across the country. Actress Winona Ryder, who had grown up in Petaluma, offered a $200,000 reward for information leading to Polly's safe return. Thousands of volunteers organized searches. The FBI joined local law enforcement. The nation held its breath for 65 days. Then, on November 28, 1993, a property owner inspecting her land after recent logging work discovered items that seemed connected to the case. A torn pair of ballet leggings that the FBI crime lab would later match to leggings recovered from Polly's bedroom on the night of the abduction. Investigators pulled records of calls from that area on the night of October 1st and identified the field identification card that the two deputies had filled out when they stopped a man beside a ditch. That man was Richard Allen Davis. His palm print, which had been lifted from the Kloss home the night of the kidnapping, was re-examined and matched. Davis was arrested on November 30th, 1993. In custody, he confessed. He led authorities to a shallow grave just off Highway 101, south of Cloverdale, California, roughly 30 road miles from the hillside, where he had been stopped by deputies on the very night it happened. Polly had been strangled. She was found on December 4th, 65 days after she had been taken from her bedroom. The trial began April 17th, 1996. In Santa Clara County after the case was moved, due to the intense local coverage in Sonoma County. From the outset, Davis's own defense team acknowledged in their opening statement that Davis had committed the kidnapping and killing. Their strategy was not to deny the crime, but to fight the special circumstances, specifically the allegation of an attempted lewd act on a child, which would determine whether Davis could face the death penalty. Prosecutor Greg Jacobs methodically laid out evidence of premeditation, intent, and Davis's long history of predatory violence. The jury was not persuaded by the defense. On June 18, 1996, the jury found Richard Allen Davis guilty of first-degree murder with 4 special circumstances: kidnapping, robbery, burglary, and attempted lewd act on a child under 14. Yeah, the penalty phase deliberations did not take long. The jury recommended death. What happened next became one of the most stunning courtroom moments in modern American legal history. At his formal sentencing, as the Klaas family sat watching and cameras rolled, Davis turned toward the courtroom and extended both middle fingers, a gesture of pure contempt directed at Polly's family and the entire proceeding. Then he made a statement so inflammatory and cruel that it drew audible gasps from the gallery. Judge Thomas Hastings looked at Davis and told him, in measured but unmistakable terms, that Davis's conduct in that courtroom had made the decision to impose the death sentence significantly easier. He then formally sentenced Richard Allen Davis to death. Davis has remained on California's death row ever since, first at San Quentin's Adjustment Center, where he remains as of early 2026. In 2024, his attorneys attempted to leverage recent California sentencing reform legislation to argue for a resentencing hearing. A Santa Clara County judge denied the petition outright, and Polly's father, Mark Klaas, who had spent 3 decades building the Klaas Kids Foundation in his daughter's memory, stood outside the courthouse and told reporters that he hoped, finally, they would never hear from Richard Allen Davis again. Polly's case didn't end in that courtroom. It changed California law. The public outrage over the fact that a twice-convicted kidnapper had been paroled and reoffended fueled the passage of California's 3 strikes law in 1994, legislation that established mandatory longer sentences for repeat violent felons. A law written not in legislative chambers, but in the grief of a nation that had watched a little girl's face on every screen for 65 days and refused to let it happen again. The next case moves from a stolen child to a vanished wife, a story that unfolded on Christmas Eve beneath a California sky and captivated the entire country for reasons that had as much to do with betrayal as they did with murder. Number 4, Scott Peterson. On Christmas Eve 2002, while his pregnant wife was being reported missing to police, and Scott Peterson called his girlfriend and told her he was standing at the Eiffel Tower in Paris. He was not in Paris. He was in Modesto, California, and Lacey Peterson was already gone. That phone call, secretly recorded by investigators with the girlfriend's cooperation, would become one of the most chilling pieces of evidence ever presented in an American murder trial. It said everything about Scott Peterson that hours of testimony could not, about who he really was beneath the surface of a picture-perfect life, and just how little the woman he had pledged to love and protect had meant to him in the end. Scott Lee Peterson was born on October 24, 1972, in San Diego. By his early 30s, he appeared to have constructed the kind of life that photographs well. He was handsome, smooth-talking, and socially confident, a fertilizer salesman based in Modesto, who had the easy charm of someone accustomed to closing deals. He and Lassie Rocha had met as college students at California Polytechnic State University, and by all outward appearances, their marriage was bright and full of promise. Lacey was warm, vivacious, and deeply loved by the people around her. By the fall of 2002, the couple was expecting their first child, a son they had already named Connor, and preparing to welcome him into the world in February. But in November 2002, roughly a month before Lacey vanished, Scott had begun a relationship with a massage therapist named Amber Frey. He told her he was single. He told her his wife had died earlier that year. He told her he would be spending Christmas alone for the very first time. Meanwhile, in December, he quietly purchased a small fishing boat, secretly, without telling anyone in his or Lacey's family. He had not held a fishing license since 1994. Records show he applied for a new one, valid for just 2 days. On the morning of December 24th, 2002, Lacey Peterson, 8 months pregnant, was reported missing. Scott told police he had left the house that morning around 9:30, stopped by his warehouse, and then driven his truck and trailer with that newly purchased boat to the Berkeley Marina to go fishing in San Francisco Bay, roughly 90 miles from home. He said he had last seen Lacey alive before he left. Witnesses who saw him at the marina that morning would later confirm his presence there. What no one could confirm was whether Lacey had been alive when he left. Within weeks, the case consumed the national media. Lacey's face was everywhere. On missing posters, on television screens, on the front pages of newspapers across the country. Thousands of volunteers organized search parties around Modesto. Her family pleaded publicly for information, and Scott Peterson, through it all, appeared to family members and observers with a strange emotional distance that drew whispers from the very beginning. Lacey's cousin, Harvey Kemple, would later tell a jury that he saw more reaction from Scott over burnt chicken at a backyard barbecue than over the disappearance of his pregnant wife. Then came the revelation that shattered whatever remained of Scott's public image. On January 24th, 2003, 1 month after Lacey went missing, Amber Frey stepped before a wall of cameras with her attorney, Gloria Allred, and told the world that she had been in a romantic relationship with Scott Peterson. She had believed he was a widower. When she saw his face on the news in connection with his missing wife, she had immediately contacted police, and she had agreed, from that point forward, to continue speaking with Scott while secretly recording their conversations for investigators. The recordings were extraordinary. In one call, as volunteers conducted a public candlelight vigil for Lacey outside in Modesto, Scott called Frey and told her he was in Europe watching New Year's celebrations near the Eiffel Tower. He was not in Europe. He was blocks away from the vigil. On April 13, 2003, the body of a male infant, later confirmed through DNA to be Connor Peterson, washed ashore at Point Isabel near Richmond on the edge of San Francisco Bay. Now, 1 day later, a severely decomposed body identified as Lacey Peterson was found on the shoreline less than 2 miles away. The discovery site was 1 to 2 miles north of where Scott Peterson had reportedly been fishing on Christmas Eve morning. Scott was arrested on April 18, 2003, near the San Diego area, not far from the Mexican border. He had dyed his hair blonde, grown a goatee, and was carrying more than $10,000 in cash, camping gear, multiple cell phones, his brother's driver's license, and his sister's credit card. He pleaded not guilty to 2 counts of murder. The trial that followed became one of the most watched legal proceedings of the early 2000s. It was moved from Modesto to Redwood City in San Mateo County due to the saturation coverage, and cameras were barred from the courtroom, which only seemed to intensify the public hunger for information. Scott retained prominent defense attorney Mark Garagos, known for his high-profile celebrity clientele. Lead prosecutor Rick DiStaso had no murder weapon, no eyewitness, and no forensic evidence placing Scott at the scene of a crime. The case was built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence, and yet it was formidable. Prosecutors presented 174 witnesses over 19 weeks. The secretly recorded phone calls between Scott and Amber Frey were played in their entirety, and they were devastating. The jury heard Scott referring to himself as a widower before Lacey's body had even been found. They heard him lie about his location, his life, and his feelings without a moment's hesitation. They heard the detached, yet calculating voice of a man who had already, in his own mind, moved on. The prosecution argued that Scott's motive was simple. He wanted out of his marriage and impending fatherhood, and he chose the most permanent solution available. Garagos countered with a theory that Lacey had been killed by an unknown person she surprised during a neighborhood burglary, and that his client was being railroaded by media pressure and a biased public. Peterson did not take the stand, but the recordings, the timeline, the secret boat, the hidden relationship, and the flight toward the Mexican border told a story the jury found impossible to disbelieve. On November 12, 2004, 23 months after Lacey Peterson was reported missing on Christmas Eve, and the verdict was read aloud in a hushed Redwood City courtroom while crowds gathered outside. Scott Lee Peterson, guilty of the first-degree murder of Lacey Denise Peterson, and guilty of the second-degree murder of their unborn son, Connor. The crowd outside erupted. Inside, by all accounts, Scott Peterson showed almost nothing. In December 2004, the jury recommended death. On March 16, 2005, Judge Alfred DeLucchi formally sentenced Scott Peterson to death by lethal injection, and he was transferred to San Quentin State Prison. In August 2020, the California Supreme Court overturned the death sentence, not the conviction, citing errors in the jury selection process during the penalty phase. In December 2021, Scott Peterson was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Yeah, he remains incarcerated in California to this day. The case also changed federal law. Congress passed the Unborn Victims of Violence Act in 2004, commonly known as Lacey and Connor's Law. recognizing an unborn child as a separate victim in federal crimes of violence. It was signed into law the same year Scott Peterson was convicted. Lacey and her son, Connor, are buried together at Burwood Cemetery in Stanislaus County, their headstone bearing not the name Peterson, but Lacey's maiden name, Rocha, as her mother requested. And as Peterson sat in prison filing appeal after appeal, another California killer was preparing to make headlines for an entirely different reason. Not as a husband with a secret life, but as a music legend with a loaded gun and a dead woman on his floor. Number 5, Phil Spector. He was a genius, and that much was never in dispute. By the time Phil Spector was 21 years old, he was already a self-made millionaire, a boy from the Bronx who had arrived in Los Angeles and, almost single-handedly, reinvented the way popular music was recorded. He called it the Wall of Sound. Layers upon layers of instruments, voices, and echo stacked so densely together that the music felt less like something you heard and more like something you walked inside. The Righteous Brothers, the Ronettes, George Harrison, John Lennon, Tina Turner, the Ramones. His fingerprints were on some of the most beloved recordings in history. In 1989, he was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And somewhere along the way, behind the gates of his 35-room Alhambra mansion, it's surrounded by guns and yes men and an increasingly fractured grip on reality, something went terribly wrong. Philip Harvey Spector was born on December 26, 1939, in the Bronx, New York. His father died by suicide when Phil was 9 years old. The family relocated to Los Angeles, and by his teenage years, Spector had already demonstrated a musical instinct that bordered on the supernatural. He co-wrote and produced his first hit, To Know Him Is to Love Him, at 17, a song whose title he pulled directly from the inscription on his father's gravestone. From that foundation of early grief, he built an empire. By the mid-1960s, his name appeared on records that defined a generation. His innovations in studio technique were studied and emulated worldwide. The Beatles, returning from their American tours, absorbed his influence into their own work. He produced their final album. He worked with Lennon on Imagine and Instant Karma. He was, by every professional measure, a legend. But the private Phil Spector existed in a very different world. Accounts from people who worked with him, dated as far back as the 1960s and accelerating through the following decades, described a man who was increasingly paranoid, controlling, and volatile. Someone who kept loaded firearms close at hand and did not hesitate to display them when he felt threatened, disrespected, or simply displeased. Multiple women who had spent time with him over the years would later come forward with accounts of guns being pointed at them, guns being brandished as a means of keeping them from leaving. Guns used as instruments of power and intimidation, as these incidents never resulted in formal charges. And so, Spector continued building his legend and his fortress simultaneously, withdrawing further and further behind the walls of his Alhambra estate. A sprawling Gothic property locales had nicknamed the Pyrenees Castle. On the evening of Saturday, February 1st, 2003, Lana Jean Clarkson was working at the House of Blues in West Hollywood, where she had taken a hostess position. Lana was 40 years old, originally from Long Beach, California, a tall and striking woman who had spent her career as an actress and model, earning her most devoted following from a series of action and fantasy films in the 1980s. She had small roles in iconic films like Fast Times at Ridgemont High and Scarface. As she went to Comic-Con conventions and signed autographs for fans who still remembered her from Barbarian Queen. She was, by all accounts from those who knew her, warm, resilient, and actively working to rebuild momentum in a career that had been quiet for some years. 2 days before her death, she and her mother had gone shopping for flat shoes she could wear comfortably on the job. She had told her mother she loved her. She had RSVP'd to a friend's party. She was making plans. Phil Spector arrived at the House of Blues that night as a patron. When he attempted to enter the foundation room, the private VIP section, without the proper wristband, Lana stopped him and asked him to wait. Staff informed her who he was and asked her to give him a seat. He was a VIP. He had left large tips before. Spector and Clarkson exchanged pleasantries over the course of the evening. When closing time came, in the early hours of February 3rd, Spector invited Lana to come back to his home for a drink. She was, by some accounts, hesitant. She went. Spector's personal chauffeur, a man named Adriano de Souza, drove them to the Alhambra estate and waited outside in the limousine as the two went inside. Approximately 2 hours later, de Souza heard the sharp crack of a single gunshot. Moments afterward, Phil Spector emerged from the back door of the mansion. In his hand was a revolver. According to de Souza's sworn testimony, the first words out of Spector's mouth were, "I think I just shot her." When Los Angeles County Sheriff's deputies arrived, they found Lana Clarkson slumped in a chair near the back of the foyer, many a single gunshot wound having entered through her mouth. The gun, a Colt Cobra .38 caliber revolver, was found on the floor near her feet. The coroner's office conducted an autopsy and determined that the bullet had traveled at a downward angle, which forensic experts noted was inconsistent with a self-inflicted wound. The coroner officially ruled the death a homicide in September 2003. Phil Spector, meanwhile, had already been telling a different story. He told a responding officer that he did not know where the gun had come from and that the woman had started waving it around. In a letter to friends, he described the shooting as an accidental suicide. In a July 2003 interview with Esquire magazine, he offered the phrase that would follow him for the rest of his life. "She kissed the gun. I have no idea why." In November 2003, Ray Spector was formally charged with second-degree murder. He pleaded not guilty. What followed was one of the most protracted and theatrically bizarre criminal proceedings in Los Angeles legal history. Spector retained a rotating cast of celebrity defense attorneys over the years. Robert Shapiro, who had been part of the O.J. Simpson defense, Leslie Abramson, who had represented the Menendez brothers, and Bruce Cutler, once the attorney for mob boss John Gotti. He cycled through them, firing and replacing counsel repeatedly, sometimes mid-trial. Meanwhile, his courtroom appearances became events unto themselves. Flamboyant outfits, dramatic hairstyles that changed from week to week. A theatrical presentation that seemed to belong more to performance art than legal proceedings. During the first trial, that cameras were allowed inside the courtroom, and the proceedings were broadcast live on court TV. The first trial began in April 2007, 4 years after Clarkson's death. Prosecutors presented 5 women who testified they had been threatened with guns by Spector during private encounters in the years before Lana Clarkson's death. A pattern of behavior they argued was neither new nor accidental. Lead detective Rich Tomlin testified about the forensic evidence, including the downward trajectory of the bullet and blood spatter patterns that did not align with the defense's theory. The defense countered that Clarkson had been struggling with depression over her stalled career, that she was under the influence that night, and that she had taken her own life in Spector's home. Defense forensic scientist, Dr. Henry Lee, who had testified in the O.J. Simpson trial, was accused during proceedings of having concealed a piece of evidence from the crime scene. The jury ultimately never heard his full testimony. After 5 months and 44 hours of deliberation across 12 days, the jury reported it was deadlocked. 10 votes for conviction, 2 for acquittal. The judge declared a mistrial. The second trial began in October 2008, this time without cameras. The evidence was largely the same. The chauffeur's testimony, the 5 prior incidents with other women, the forensic analysis. But the presentation was sharper, and the distraction of the cameras was gone. On April 13, 2009, after a shorter deliberation, the jury found Phil Spector guilty of second-degree murder in the death of Lana Clarkson. On May 29, 2009, he was sentenced to 19 years to life in state prison. He was 69 years old. His appeals were rejected by the California Court of Appeal in 2011, and by the California Supreme Court that same year, and by the United States Supreme Court in 2012. He remained incarcerated at the California Healthcare Facility in Stockton, where his health declined steadily. Spector contracted COVID-19 and died on January 16, 2021, at the age of 81, still proclaiming his innocence, still calling what had happened to Lana Clarkson in his foyer an accidental suicide. He had been eligible for a parole hearing in 2024. He never made it there. Lana Clarkson had told her mother she would call the next day. The call never came. She is remembered by those who knew her not as a footnote in Phil Spector's story, but as someone who loved her work, her fans, and the people around her, a woman whose life was ended in a stranger's hallway before the next chapter she was already planning could begin. The next case leaves the mansions of Los Angeles behind entirely. Anne heads into the wilderness, where one of America's most haunting killing sprees unfolded beneath the shadow of Yosemite National Park, carried out by a man with a secret no one around him ever suspected. Number 6. Cary Stayner. In 1980, America celebrated a miracle. 7-year-old Stephen Stayner, kidnapped from his California hometown and missing for 7 years, had walked out of captivity with another boy he had saved. He returned home a hero. The story was made into a television movie. The nation exhaled, and somewhere in the background of every photograph, every interview, and every moment of Stephen's homecoming stood his older brother Cary, quiet, smiling, forgotten. 19 years later, Cary Stayner would commit 4 murders near Yosemite National Park that shocked the country in ways his brother's rescue never could. Cary Anthony Stayner was born on August 13, 1961, in Merced, California, the eldest of 5 children. By all outward appearances, he was a normal kid. Good enough at school, somewhat withdrawn, but nothing alarming. Then, on December 4, 1972, when Cary was 11 years old, his 7-year-old brother Stephen vanished. A man named Kenneth Parnell had taken him. For 7 years, the Stayner family lived in limbo. Flyers, searches, prayers, and silence. Cary later told investigators that during those years, no one asked how he was doing. All the attention, all the grief, and all the hope, it centered on Stephen. And when Stephen finally escaped in 1980, returning home with 5-year-old Timothy White, another boy Parnell had kidnapped, the world once again fixed its gaze on the younger Stayner brother. Cary remained in the margins. Stephen adjusted to life back home as best he could. He married, had children, tried to move forward. But in 1989, at the age of 24, Stephen Stayner was killed in a motorcycle crash. The family was devastated. And then, just over a year later, in December 1990, Cary's uncle, Jesse Stayner, with whom Cary had been living, was shot to death inside their shared Merced home. The murder was never solved. Cary Stayner became a suspect. Nothing was ever proven, but something inside him, according to later psychological evaluations, had begun to fracture long before. By 1997, and Cary had drifted to the Sierra Nevada foothills and taken a job as a handyman at the Cedar Lodge Motel in El Portal, California, a small, unassuming property just outside the Highway 140 entrance to Yosemite National Park. He lived in a small apartment above the motel. He fixed leaks, repaired fences, and kept to himself. People who knew him described him as soft-spoken, polite, even friendly. A woman who had dated him briefly and whose young daughters had adored him said he seemed safe. No one suspected what he had been carrying inside for decades. Cary Stayner would later tell FBI agents that he had been fantasizing about killing women for 30 years, since he was 11 years old. On the evening of February 15, 1999, 3 tourists checked into the Cedar Lodge: 42-year-old Carol Sund, her 15-year-old daughter Julie, and their 16-year-old Argentine exchange student and family friend, Silvina Palazzo. They had spent the day hiking in Yosemite and planned to relax that night watching rented videos in their room. Around 10 p.m., there was a knock at the door. It was the motel's handyman. He said he needed to check a leak in the bathroom. They let him in. What happened next was methodical and merciless. Cary Stayner emerged from the bathroom holding a gun and told the 3 that if they cooperated, he would not hurt them. Then he bound them with duct tape. He strangled Carol Sund. He shot her. He assaulted and shot Silvina Palazzo in that same room. Then he forced Julie Sund into his vehicle and drove her to a vista point near Lake Don Pedro, where he assaulted her and cut her throat. He returned to the motel and placed the bodies of Carol Sund and Silvina Palazzo into the trunk of their rental car and drove it to a remote location off Highway 108 near Long Barn. He set the car on fire. On March 18, 1999, a passerby spotted the charred Pontiac Grand Prix hidden in the brush. The next day, investigators opened the trunk and found the burned remains of 2 bodies. Dental records confirmed the victims were Carol Sund and Silvina Palazzo. A week later, on March 25th, authorities received an anonymous note with a hand-drawn map. At the top of the note were the words, "We had fun with this one." The map led investigators to the decomposed body of Julie Sund, near the shore of Don Pedro Reservoir. Cary Stayner had sent the note himself. For months, the investigation stalled. Authorities interviewed employees at Cedar Lodge, including Cary Stayner, but found nothing to raise suspicion. He had no history of violence. He was calm. He had even told investigators a story about his famous younger brother. They let him go. Then, on July 21st, 1999, 26-year-old Joey Ruth Armstrong, a naturalist working for the Yosemite Institute, was at her cabin in Foresta, a remote area within the park boundaries. The next morning, hikers found her decapitated body near a stream. Witnesses reported having seen a pale blue 1972 International Scout parked outside her cabin the day before. Investigators traced the vehicle to Cary Stayner. This time, they did not let him walk away. They searched his truck, questioned him, and warned him not to leave town. He disappeared anyway. On July 24th, 1999, FBI agents tracked him to the Laguna del Sol nudist resort outside Sacramento. They took him into custody. What followed was one of the most chilling confessions in FBI history. Special Agent Jeffrey Rinnick sat down with Stayner over pizza. Before he would say anything, Stayner made 3 requests. He wanted images of young girls, he wanted his family to receive the reward money, and he wanted to be housed in a federal prison close to his family. Rinnick told him to choose one. Stayner chose the images of children. He chose it over money for his family. He chose it over being near the people who loved him. Then, over the next 6 hours, he confessed to all 4 murders. Every calculated, horrific detail. He described how he had been fantasizing about killing women since childhood. He spoke calmly, methodically, and without remorse. Cary Stayner faced 2 separate legal proceedings. In November 2000, he was tried in federal court for the murder of Joy Armstrong. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Then, in 2002, he was tried in state court for the murders of Carol Sund, Yuli Sund, and Silvina Peloso. His defense argued insanity, citing his traumatic childhood, his brother's kidnapping, and allegations that Stayner himself had been sexually abused by a family member. Prosecutors presented his detailed confession, forensic evidence linking him to the crime scenes, and testimony about his long-standing violent fantasies. On August 26, 2002, after months of testimony, the jury found Cary Stayner guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances including kidnapping and sexual assault. In December 2002, Nahi was formally sentenced to death. The judge handed down the sentence 3 times, once for each of the victims in the state case. Cary Stayner is currently 63 years old and remains on death row at San Quentin State Prison, the same facility that houses Scott Peterson and other high-profile California killers. In the years since, investigators have looked at Cary Stayner as a possible suspect in at least 5 other unsolved murders across California's Central Valley, dating back to the early 1980s, including the 1982 disappearance of a woman who was last seen near Yosemite and whose remains were identified decades later through DNA. He has never been charged in those cases. But the FBI agent who took his confession believes the 4 confirmed victims are the full extent of his killing. Stayner, the agent noted, that was not particularly efficient. He left evidence. He made mistakes. If there had been more, they likely would have surfaced. The Stayner family tragedy is a story with no winners. A younger brother stolen and traumatized, an older brother whose pain was never addressed, and 4 women whose lives were ended by someone the world had stopped noticing long ago. Cary Stayner once told investigators he felt invisible. By the time anyone truly saw him, it was far too late. But if Cary Stayner's crimes unfolded in the wilderness where few were watching, the next case exploded in plain sight. Broadcast live on every major network, watched by millions, as a former police officer turned the city of Los Angeles into a battlefield and declared war on the department he once served. Number 7, Christopher Dorner. On February 6, 2013, the Los Angeles Police Department did something it almost never does. It issued a public warning, not about a neighborhood, not about a suspect on the loose, but about its own officers. Every cop named in a viral manifesto, every family member connected to them, every friend who had ever worn the badge alongside them. All of them were told to go into hiding. Because somewhere out there in Southern California, heavily armed and trained by the Navy and the LAPD itself, was a man who had declared war. His name was Christopher Dorner, and for 9 days, he turned one of America's largest metropolitan areas into a battlefield, broadcast live on every screen in the country. Christopher Jordan. Dorner was born on June 4th, 1979, in New York, but raised in Southern California. As a child growing up in Orange County, he had been, by multiple accounts, bullied, racially taunted at the predominantly white Christian school he attended from 1st through 7th grade. But he was also someone who seemed to respond to structure, discipline, and a sense of mission. As a teenager, he enrolled in the La Palma Police Department's youth program. He wanted to be a cop. He studied political science at Southern Utah University. He joined the U.S. Navy Reserve and became an officer, earning recognition for his marksmanship and his adherence to military values of integrity and honor. In 2002, while attending pilot training in Oklahoma, he and a classmate found a bag containing nearly $8,000 that had been meant for a local church. They turned it into the police without hesitation. When asked why, Dorner said, "The military stresses integrity." His mother, Oz, he added, had taught him the same. In 2005, Christopher Dorner entered the Los Angeles Police Academy. It should have been the realization of a lifelong dream. Instead, it became the beginning of a spiral. Dorner struggled. He took 13 months to graduate, twice the standard time. He was involved in physical altercations with other recruits. He accidentally shot himself in the hand during training. Still, he made it through and was assigned to patrol. Then, in July 2007, while working with his training officer, a veteran cop named Teresa Evans, Dorner filed a formal complaint alleging that Evans had kicked a man with dementia during an arrest. An internal investigation followed. Evans denied it. The man's father initially supported Dorner's account, then recanted, saying he had not actually witnessed the incident. The LAPD's Board of Rights found that Dorner had fabricated the allegation. In 2008, he was terminated for filing a false report. Dorner appealed. He filed a lawsuit. He lost. His appeals were rejected by the California Court of Appeal in 2011. His employment with the LAPD was over. His naval career continued for a time, but by early 2013, that too was ending. On February 1st, 2013, Christopher Dorner was honorably discharged from the Navy Reserve with the rank of lieutenant. That same day, surveillance footage captured him purchasing multiple scuba tanks at a sporting goods store in Torrance. Days later, a package arrived at the offices of CNN addressed to journalist Anderson Cooper. Inside was a DVD, a bullet-riddled commemorative coin, and a note. On the evening of Sunday, February 3rd, 2013, the 28-year-old Monica Kwan and her 27-year-old fiancé Keith Lawrence sat in their car on the top floor of a parking garage at their condominium complex in Irvine, California. They had just returned from a basketball game. Monica was an assistant basketball coach at Cal State Fullerton. Keith worked as a campus security officer at the University of Southern California. They were planning a wedding. Someone approached the vehicle and opened fire. Both were killed. At first, investigators had no clear motive. There were no signs of robbery. The scene was clean. Then, on February 4th, a 13-page manifesto appeared online, posted to Christopher Dorner's Facebook page. It was 11,000 words long, and it explained everything. In the manifesto, Dorner detailed his belief that the LAPD was riddled with racism, that corruption and retaliation. He named approximately 40 individuals, officers, their families, and anyone associated with his termination, and declared that he was waging unconventional and asymmetric warfare against them. He wrote that he had been framed for reporting excessive force and that the department's internal disciplinary system was designed to silence whistleblowers. He stated plainly, "You will now live the life of the prey." And then he explained why Monica Kwan had been his first target. Her father, Randall Kwan, was a retired LAPD captain who had later worked as an attorney representing officers in disciplinary hearings, including Christopher Dorner's. In the manifesto, Dorner wrote, "I never had the opportunity to have a family of my own. I'm terminating yours." The LAPD immediately mobilized protection details for everyone named in the document. Panic spread through law enforcement agencies across Southern California. Dorner was trained. He was armed, and he had made it clear he was just getting started. In the early hours of February 7th, officers guarding a home in Corona spotted a vehicle matching the description of Dorner's truck. Shots were fired. No one was hit. Less than 20 minutes later, 2 Riverside police officers sitting in their patrol car at a red light were ambushed. 34-year-old Officer Michael Crane was killed. His partner was critically wounded. A witness would later describe seeing a man in camouflage and wraparound goggles, grinning, as he pointed an assault rifle out of a truck window and fired. Within hours, the fear reached a breaking point. LAPD officers protecting a captain's home in Torrance saw a truck that resembled Dorner's vehicle and opened fire from behind. Inside were 2 women, a mother and daughter delivering newspapers in the pre-dawn hours. One was shot twice. The other suffered minor injuries. In a separate incident the same morning, Torrance police rammed another pickup truck and opened fire on the driver. That man, too, was innocent. LAPD Chief Charlie Beck would later call it a tragic case of mistaken identity. The city quickly settled a lawsuit with the 2 women for $4.2 million. Later that day, Dorner's truck was found burned out on a remote fire trail near Big Bear Lake in the San Bernardino Mountains. Hundreds of officers swarmed the area. Schools went into lockdown. Eddie's helicopters equipped with thermal imaging swept the forest. For days, there was nothing. A $1 million reward was offered. Tips poured in from across the country. Anxiety mounted. Some members of the public began expressing support for Dorner online, calling him a whistleblower, a victim of corruption. The LAPD, stung by the criticism, reopened the investigation into Dorner's termination. But the manhunt continued. On the afternoon of February 12th, 9 days into the siege, a couple in Big Bear reported that a man matching Dorner's description had broken into their cabin, tied them up briefly, and stolen their vehicle. Within minutes, law enforcement converged. A pursuit began. It ended at another cabin deep in the forest near Angeles Oaks. Dorner was inside. What followed was broadcast live on television. Hundreds of officers surrounded the structure. Gunfire erupted. San Bernardino County Sheriff's Detective Jeremiah McKay, age 35, was shot and killed. Another deputy was wounded. Authorities deployed tear gas. Then, at some point during the standoff, the cabin caught fire. Whether it was ignited by the tear gas canisters, by Dorner himself, or by some other means remains disputed. The structure burned rapidly. A single gunshot was heard from inside. The fire consumed everything. By the time it was safe to enter, the cabin was a charred skeleton. On February 14th, 2013, dental records confirmed that the remains found inside belonged to Christopher Dorner. He had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. In total, Dorner killed 4 people: Monica Kwan, Keith Lawrence, Officer Michael Crane, and Detective Jeremiah McKay, and wounded several others. His 9-day rampage paralyzed Southern California, triggered a national conversation about racism and accountability within the LAPD, and exposed serious questions about the use of force by officers during the manhunt itself. A report issued months later found widespread concern within the department that its internal disciplinary process was inconsistent and discriminated based on race, gender, and rank. Dorner's manifesto, for all its violence, had forced a reckoning, but it had also left 4 families destroyed, a region traumatized, and a legacy that remains deeply contested. Some seeing him as a murderer who targeted innocent people, others as a whistleblower, driven to desperation by a system that refused to listen. What is certain is that Christopher Dorner believed he had been wronged, and he decided that vengeance broadcast live on national television was the only response left to him. He was wrong, and 4 people paid the price for that belief with their lives. The manhunt for Christopher Dorner ended in fire and death on a California mountainside. But the next case on our list didn't need a manhunt at all, because when investigators arrived, they found a 7-year-old girl who could tell them exactly who had taken her and exactly where he lived. Number 8, David Westerfield. The search began at dawn. Thousands of volunteers fanned out across San Diego County, through canyons, along highways, into the desert, looking for a 7-year-old girl who had vanished from her bedroom while her parents slept. They carried flyers with her face. Yeah, they called her name into the wind. For 25 days, the community held its breath. And when searchers finally found Daniel Van Dam's body in the remote brush off Dehesa Road, decomposed beyond recognition, the man responsible was not a stranger who had come from nowhere. He was someone who lived on the same quiet street, someone who had been inside the family's home days before, someone the parents had met at a local bar and considered, if not a friend, then at least a familiar face. David Westerfield was arrested 5 days before Danielle's body was even discovered, and by the time the trial ended, forensic evidence had woven a web so tight that there was nowhere left for him to hide. David Allen Westerfield was born in 1952 and grew up in Southern California. By his late 40s, he had built what appeared to be a stable, unremarkable life. He had worked for years as a design engineer, owned a home in the upscale Sabre Springs neighborhood of San Diego, and maintained a recreational vehicle he took on solo camping trips. He was twice divorced with 2 adult children. To most who knew him, he seemed quiet, private, and relatively harmless. There were no red flags visible to the outside world, no prior arrests for violence, no public scandals. Just a middle-aged man living alone in a 2-story house on a cul-de-sac, where families with young children played outside and life moved at the pace of weekend barbecues and Girl Scout cookie sales. Daniel Van Dam was 7 years old, a bright, energetic second grader who loved school, her family, and her dog. She lived with her parents, Brenda and Damon, and her 2 younger brothers in a home just 2 doors down from David Westerfield's residence. On Friday evening, February 1st, 2002, Brenda Van Dam went out with 2 girlfriends to a bar in nearby Poway called Dad's. Damon stayed home with the children. He put Danielle and her brothers to bed around 10:30 that night. Brenda returned home around 2 a.m. with her friends and 2 male acquaintances they had met at the bar. They noticed the security alarm monitor was flashing and the side garage door was open. They closed it, ate something, and chatted. Damon woke up and joined them. After the friends left, Brenda and Damon went to bed. Sometime during the night, Damon awoke again and noticed the alarm monitor flashing. He went downstairs and found the door to the backyard standing open. He closed it and went back to bed. The next morning, Saturday, February 2nd, when Danielle did not come out of her room for breakfast, her parents went to check on her. Her bed was empty. Danielle was gone. The Van Dams immediately called the police. Within hours, a missing child report had been filed and a massive search operation was launched. Neighbors, friends, strangers, thousands of volunteers organized search parties that combed every corner of San Diego County. The Laura Recovery Center, a nonprofit specializing in child abductions, flew in from Texas to coordinate the effort. A command center was set up. Flyers were distributed. Media coverage exploded. For weeks, Danielle's face was on every television screen, every newspaper, every streetlight pole. The entire region was searching. Detectives began interviewing everyone in the neighborhood. And among them was David Westerfield, who lived across the street and 2 doors down. On the morning of Monday, February 4th, 2 days after Danielle's disappearance, Westerfield returned home from what he claimed had been a solo camping trip in his motorhome to the desert and the beach. He gave police written consent to search his house and his RV. A cadaver dog showed interest near his garage, but did not give a full alert. Officers noted that Westerfield seemed cooperative, but also nervous. He told them he had left Friday night, driven around, and returned Monday. He claimed he had not heard about Danielle's disappearance until he got home, but investigators quickly began noticing inconsistencies. Westerfield's timeline did not add up. Surveillance footage and receipts placed him at locations that contradicted his story. As he had been at a dry cleaner's on Saturday morning, hours after Danielle vanished, dropping off bedding, a comforter, and a jacket. He had stopped at a car wash. He had been seen driving erratically, and when forensic analysts examined the items he had dropped off at the dry cleaner, they found 2 small stains, blood stains, Daniel Van Dam's blood. On February 22, 2002, police arrested David Westerfield as he walked out of his attorney's office in downtown San Diego. He was charged with kidnapping. 5 days later, on February 27th, 2 volunteer searchers walking near a trail off Dehesa Road in a remote area of East County found Danielle's body. It was badly decomposed, partially mummified, and had been ravaged by animals and the elements. The coroner could not determine a precise cause of death or confirm whether she had been sexually assaulted. Dental records were used to confirm her identity. The charge against Westerfield was upgraded to first-degree murder with a special circumstance: murder committed during a kidnapping, which made him eligible for the death penalty. The trial began on June 4, 2002, and it was televised. For 2 months, the nation watched as prosecutors laid out a forensic case so comprehensive that it became a textbook example of physical evidence linking a suspect to a victim. Danielle's blood was found not only on Westerfield's jacket, but also on the carpet inside his motorhome. Her fingerprints, including a handprint, were found on a cabinet above the bed in the RV. And hairs consistent with her DNA profile were discovered in the bathroom of his motorhome, in his washing machine, in his dryer, and on the bedding from his master bedroom. Fibers matching those later found with Danielle's body were present in his motorhome, his SUV, his laundry, and his bedding. Fibers similar to those from Danielle's bedroom carpet were found throughout his RV. And perhaps most damning, hairs from the Van Dam family dog were discovered on the comforter Westerfield had dropped off at the dry cleaner, on the carpet in his motorhome, and in his laundry. Prosecutors argued that Westerfield had entered the Van Dam home through the unlocked side garage door sometime in the early morning hours of February 2nd, taken Danielle from her bed, brought her to his house or motorhome, assaulted and killed her, and then driven her body to the remote location where it was later found. The timeline matched, the physical evidence matched, and investigators presented testimony from forensic entomologists who analyzed insect activity on Danielle's remains and concluded she had been placed at the Dehesa Road site sometime between February 14th and 18th, consistent with Westerfield's movements during that period. The defense argued contamination, questioned the reliability of DNA transfers, presented character witnesses who described Westerfield as non-violent, and raised doubts about the police investigation. They suggested the evidence had been planted or that secondary transfer could explain the forensic findings. The jury was not persuaded. On August 21, 2002, after 9 days of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. David Westerfield, guilty of first-degree murder with special circumstances, guilty of kidnapping a child under the age of 14, and guilty of possession of child pornography. The courtroom erupted. Outside on the steps of the San Diego courthouse, cheers echoed through the crowd of supporters who had waited for months for this moment. The penalty phase followed, and the jury recommended death. On January 3, 2003, Judge William Mudd formally sentenced David Westerfield to death by lethal injection. Westerfield was sent to death row at San Quentin State Prison. He appealed. In 2019, the California Supreme Court upheld both his conviction and his death sentence in a 490-page opinion that systematically rejected every argument his defense team had raised. The court found that the forensic evidence was overwhelming, that the trial had been fair, and that the jury's verdict was supported by the facts. In 2024, as California continued its moratorium on executions, Westerfield, now 72 years old, was transferred off death row and moved to High Desert State Prison, where he remains incarcerated. He has maintained his innocence since the day of his arrest, claiming in letters and interviews that he was framed by police under pressure to solve a high-profile case. No credible evidence has ever emerged to support that claim. Danielle Van Dam's legacy endures in San Diego. An overpass on Interstate 8, near where her body was found, has been named the Danielle Van Dam Memorial Overpass. A wooden stairway was built at the site so mourners could leave flowers, teddy bears, and photographs. Her case prompted heightened awareness of child safety across the region and became a rallying point for stronger laws protecting children from predators who hide in plain sight. Brenda Van Dam, Danielle's mother, released a statement in 2019 after the California Supreme Court denied Westerfield's appeal. She wrote, "The cruel irony is that Judge Mudd, Prosecutor Woody Clark, and Danielle are no longer alive, but he is. It's time for justice to be served for Danielle." But while David Westerfield's case was built on forensic science and painstaking detective work, the next case on our list required no science at all, because the killer handed investigators a confession, a motive, and a victim's name before anyone even knew a crime had been committed. Number 9, Jesse James Hollywood. And he had a name that sounded like it belonged in a Western, Jesse James Hollywood. And for 5 years, he lived like an outlaw too, hiding in plain sight on the beaches of Brazil while the FBI searched the world for him. But Jesse James Hollywood wasn't robbing trains or banks. He was a 20-year-old mid-level marijuana dealer from the San Fernando Valley who made one impulsive, catastrophic decision on a Sunday afternoon in August 2000. He kidnapped a 15-year-old boy to settle a $1,200 drug debt. Then, 3 days later, after consulting with a lawyer and realizing what he had done carried a life sentence, he made a second decision, one that would make him one of the youngest people ever added to the FBI's most wanted list, and turn his crime into a Hollywood movie before he ever stood trial. Jesse James Hollywood was born on January 28, 1980, and raised in West Hills, an affluent neighborhood in the western San Fernando Valley region of Los Angeles. As a child, he played in a junior baseball league and attended private school at Pinecrest in Woodland Hills. He was bright, athletic, and came from money. He had a best friend from another well-off family, and together they fashioned themselves into a duo they called the Pros, spray painting the nickname on their baggy jeans in a style that was trendy at the time. Nothing about his childhood suggested violence or tragedy, but by his late teens, Hollywood had drifted into dealing drugs, primarily marijuana, and had recruited a crew of former high school friends to help him distribute. Among them was a young man named Benjamin Markowitz, who had been a close friend. It's someone Hollywood had exercised with at a Malibu gym and played baseball alongside as a kid. By the summer of 2000, Ben Markowitz owed Jesse James Hollywood $1,200 for drugs. It wasn't an enormous sum, but Hollywood was insistent. He wanted his money. Ben was evasive, confrontational, and according to later testimony, had allegedly poisoned Hollywood's dog and broken a window at his house. The tension escalated. On Sunday, August 6, 2000, Hollywood decided it was time to confront Ben directly. He gathered a crew, including Jesse Ruggie and William Skidmore, and drove through the neighborhood looking for him. They didn't find Ben, but as they turned a corner, they saw someone else walking along the side of the road, Ben's 15-year-old half-brother, Nicholas Markowitz. And in what Hollywood would later call an irrational, poorly thought-out impulse, he made a split-second decision. They would take the kid, hold him until Ben paid up. Nicholas, known as Nick to his family and friends, was grabbed off the street in broad daylight. He was chased, beaten, forced into a white van, and driven away. Witnesses saw it happen. One woman, Pauline Mahoney, was driving with her sons when she spotted a group of men attacking a teenage boy. She didn't call the police. She assumed it was a fight between friends. Nick Markowitz was terrified at first. But over the next 3 days, something strange happened. Hollywood's crew drove Nick to Santa Barbara, over 90 miles from home. And instead of locking him in a basement or tying him up, they brought him to house parties. They gave him Valium, marijuana, and alcohol. They introduced him to girls. Witnesses who saw Nick during those days would later testify that he seemed fine, almost relaxed, like he didn't want to leave. Some said he even seemed to be having fun. Hollywood had left town early, leaving his right-hand man, Jesse Ruggie, in charge of watching Nick. For 2 days, Nick stayed at various locations, including the Lemon Tree Inn in Santa Barbara, where the partying continued. But while Nick was being plied with drugs and passed from house to house, Jesse James Hollywood was beginning to panic. He consulted with an attorney, reportedly through his father, Jack Hollywood, and asked what the legal consequences would be if someone were charged with kidnapping in California. The answer was clear: life in prison. Hollywood now understood the magnitude of what he had done. And rather than turn himself in, rather than release Nick and face the consequences, he decided the problem needed to be eliminated, permanently. On August 8, 2000, 2 days after Nick disappeared, the Markowitz family filed a missing persons report. That same day, Hollywood's crew was told to prepare for Nick's release. He was told he would be going home the next morning. Instead, on the evening of August 9th, a young man named Ryan Hoyt arrived at the Lemon Tree Inn. Hoyt was another low-level associate who owed Hollywood money for drugs. Hollywood had allegedly offered him a deal: kill Nick Markowitz, and the debt would be erased. Some accounts suggest Hollywood offered Hoyt $2,000. Others say it was simply the forgiveness of what he owed. Either way, Hoyt agreed. Hoyt drove Nick and 3 others to the Los Padres National Forest and stopped at a remote campsite area known as Lizard's Mouth in the mountains above Santa Barbara. As the group climbed the trail, Nick was told they were going to smoke marijuana and hang out. Then, without warning, one of the men struck Nick in the head with a shovel, knocking him into a shallow grave that had been dug earlier that day. Ryan Hoyt raised a Tech 9 semi-automatic handgun, a weapon Hollywood had provided, and fired 9 shots into Nick's chest and abdomen. Nick Markowitz died instantly. He was 15 years old. The group covered the body with dirt and leaves and left. According to police interviews, Jesse Ruggu became physically ill. Ryan Hoyt just stared. 4 days later, on August 13th, hikers following a foul odor discovered Nick's body. On August 16th, 2000, police arrested 4 suspects in connection with the murder. Jesse James Hollywood was not among them. He had already fled. For the next 5 years, Hollywood lived as a fugitive, eventually making his way to Brazil, where he settled in the small coastal town of Saquarema. He used fake identification, blended into the beach community, and tried to disappear. But in March 2005, after being featured on the television show America's Most Wanted, a tip led Brazilian authorities to his location. He was arrested and extradited back to the United States. At the time of his capture, he was one of the youngest people ever to appear on the FBI's Most Wanted list. Hollywood's trial began in May 2009, nearly 9 years after Nick's murder. The case had already attracted enormous media attention, not only because of the crime itself, but because in 2006, director Nick Cassavetes had released Alpha Dog, a fictionalized film starring Bruce Willis, Justin Timberlake, and Emile Hirsch that dramatized the events leading up to Nick's death. The character, Johnny Truelove, was based on Jesse James Hollywood. Hollywood's defense attorney argued that his client could not receive a fair trial because of the movie and the pretrial publicity. The judge was unmoved. During the trial, prosecutors presented testimony from more than a dozen witnesses, including members of Hollywood's own crew. Casey Sheehan testified that Hollywood had told him over dinner at an Outback Steakhouse that the situation with Nick had been taken care of. Graham Presley, who had been 17 at the time and had helped dig the grave, testified that Jesse Ruggi told him Hollywood had offered $2,000 to kill Nick. Hollywood took the stand in his own defense and denied ordering the murder. He claimed Ryan Hoyt had acted on his own, out of fear that Ben Markowitz would find out about the kidnapping. He said he was stunned when Hoyt told him what had happened. The jury did not believe him. On July 8, 2009, after 4 days of deliberation, Jesse James Hollywood was convicted of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and being a principal in a murder committed during a kidnapping, a special circumstance that made him eligible for the death penalty. During the penalty phase, both Hollywood's mother and Nick's mother, Susan Markowitz, took the stand. Susan said she was comfortable with whatever the jury decided. On July 15, 2009, the jury recommended life in prison without the possibility of parole instead of death. Judge William Gordon formalized the sentence on October 21, 2009. Jesse James Hollywood is currently serving his sentence at the Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility near San Diego. He is now 45 years old. His conviction was upheld on appeal in 2012. Ryan Hoyt, the gunman who pulled the trigger, was convicted in 2001 and sentenced to death. In January 2024, his death sentence was reduced to life without parole. Jesse Rugga, who was present during the murder, was convicted of kidnapping but acquitted of murder. He was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole and was released in 2013 after serving 11 years. Graham Presley, who dug the grave, was convicted of second-degree murder and was released in 2007. William Skidmore pleaded guilty to kidnapping and robbery and was released on parole in 2008. Nick Markowitz's parents, Jeff and Susan, have spent the years since their son's death advocating for crime awareness and speaking publicly about the dangers of drugs, impulsive decisions, and the devastating ripple effects of violence. In statements following Hollywood's conviction, Susan Markowitz said she took some comfort in knowing that justice had been served, but that no verdict could ever bring her son back. The case of Jesse James Hollywood is a story of ego, desperation, and a catastrophic miscalculation by a young man who thought he could solve a problem by making it disappear. Instead, he turned a $1,200 debt into a life sentence and guaranteed that Nick Markowitz's name would be remembered long after his own faded into infamy. And while Hollywood's crime played out over 3 days in Santa Barbara, the final case on our list unfolded in a matter of minutes on a Los Angeles stage, where an aspiring actor, desperate for money to fund his wedding, committed a murder so calculated and so cold that even seasoned detectives struggled to understand how someone could kill 2 people just to steal a few $1,000s. Number 10. Daniel Wozniak. On the evening of May 21st, 2010, Daniel Wozniak took the stage at the Hunger Artists Theater in Fullerton, California, as the lead in a community theater production of the musical Nine. He sang, he smiled, he delivered his lines with precision. The audience applauded. What none of them knew, what no one in that theater could have possibly imagined, was that just hours earlier, in an attic less than 10 miles away, Wozniak had shot his neighbor and friend in the head twice, taken his wallet and phone, and begun dismembering his body with a handsaw. And the performance wasn't over. The next night, he would kill again. Daniel Patrick Wozniak was born on March 23, 1984, and grew up in Orange County, California. By his mid-20s, he was a fixture in the local community theater scene, a charismatic actor who friends described as funny, talented, and deeply committed to his craft. He wasn't making a living from it. In fact, by 2010, Wozniak wasn't making a living from anything. He had no steady job, no income, and was facing eviction from his Costa Mesa apartment. His bank accounts were overdrawn, and he owed money to multiple people. But none of that seemed to matter, because Wozniak was planning a wedding. He was engaged to Rachel Mae Buffett, a fellow actress, and the ceremony was scheduled for May 28, 2010, just over a week away. He had booked a venue, he had sent invitations, and he had absolutely no way to pay for any of it, much less the honeymoon he had promised. Samuel Eliezer Hare, known to everyone as Sam, lived in the same apartment complex as Wozniak and Buffett. He was 26 years old, an Army veteran who had served in Afghanistan and returned home to attend Orange Coast College on the GI Bill. His fellow students described him as a big teddy bear, someone who was kind, responsible, and fun to be around. And Sam had told Wozniak that he had been disciplined with his money while deployed and had saved approximately $62,000 in combat pay. It was a nest egg he planned to use for his future. Wozniak saw it differently. He saw a solution. On May 21st, 2010, Wozniak lured Sam to a theater attic at the Joint Forces Training Base in Los Alamitos, telling him he needed help moving some equipment. Once they were alone in the attic, Wozniak pulled out a .380 caliber pistol, his father's gun, and told Sam to kneel. Then he shot him in the head. The first bullet did not kill him. Wozniak fired a second shot into the side of Sam's head. Sam Hare died in that attic. Wozniak took his wallet and his phone, then left the body where it had fallen. That night, Wozniak performed on stage in Nine as if nothing had happened. The next day, Wozniak returned to the attic. He decapitated Sam's body and cut off his hands. He placed the head and hands in a duffel bag and drove to El Dorado Nature Center in Long Beach, where he buried them in a shallow area near the trails. Sam's torso remained hidden in the attic. But Wozniak wasn't finished. He needed to make sure that when Sam's body was eventually discovered, the police would be looking in the wrong direction. So, he devised a plan to frame a dead man. Using Sam's cell phone, Wozniak sent a series of text messages to jury Julie Kibuishi, a 23-year-old college student and dancer at the Orange County School of the Arts who had been tutoring Sam. The messages, written to sound like Sam, said he was very upset and needed to talk. Around midnight on May 22nd, Julie arrived at Sam's apartment. Wozniak was waiting inside, and he told her to look at something on the bed. Then he pulled out the same gun and shot her twice in the back of the head. Julie Kibuishi died instantly. Wozniak staged the scene meticulously, ripping down her pants, positioning her body to suggest a sexual assault, leaving evidence that would point to Sam as the perpetrator. The story he wanted investigators to believe was simple. Sam Hare had assaulted and murdered Julie Kibuishi, then fled. On May 22, 2010, Sam's father, Steve Hare, made a frantic 911 call after discovering Julie's body in his son's apartment. Police immediately launched a manhunt for Sam Hare, who they believed was armed, dangerous, and on the run. For days, the search consumed Orange County. Detectives had no idea Sam was already dead, and for those days, Daniel Wozniak continued performing, both on stage and in conversations with investigators, where he played the role of concerned friend. Then, on May 26th, a 17-year-old named Wesley Freilich walked into a bank and attempted to withdraw money using Sam Herr's ATM card. When police questioned him, Wesley told them that his former theater mentor, Daniel Wozniak, had approached him and said he was working for a bail bonds agency. Wozniak claimed he needed Wesley to withdraw money from a fugitive's account, someone who had skipped bail. Wesley had believed him. He said Wozniak even showed him official-looking paperwork. Detectives now had a new question. How did Daniel Wozniak get Sam Herr's ATM card? On the night of May 28, 2010, what should have been the eve of his wedding, Daniel Wozniak was at his bachelor party when U.S. that marshals arrived and took him into custody. In the interrogation room, Wozniak delivered what investigators would later describe as a performance worthy of the stage. He lied. He cried. He told police that Sam had shown up at his door one night, panicked, and confessed to killing Julie in a fit of rage. He said he had helped Sam escape out of fear and loyalty. Then, when detectives asked for a DNA sample, Wozniak's story began to shift. He admitted to seeing Julie's body. Then, he admitted to being present when she was shot. And finally, after hours of interrogation, Daniel Wozniak confessed. It was all about the money, he told investigators. He admitted to killing Sam first, then Julie. He admitted to the dismemberment, the staging, the texts. He led police to the area in El Dorado Nature Center, where he had buried Sam's head and hands. Yet Sam's torso was found exactly where Wozniak said it would be, still in the theater attic. During a recorded jailhouse phone call with his fiancée Rachel Buffett, all calls from jail are recorded. Wozniak learned that his brother Tim had been holding onto a backpack filled with incriminating evidence, including the murder weapon. Police recovered the backpack outside Wozniak's parents' home. Inside were Sam's clothes, phone, wallet, and other items linking Wozniak directly to both crime scenes. Investigators also discovered that, in the days before the murders, Wozniak had conducted multiple Google searches on his computer: how to hide a body and quick ways to kill people. The case against Daniel Wozniak was overwhelming, but it would take more than 5 years for the trial to begin, delayed by legal battles, appeals, and procedural motions. Rachel Buffett, Wozniak's fiancée, was arrested in November 2012 and charged as an accessory after the fact to murder. Prosecutors alleged she had lied to investigators repeatedly, including claiming she had seen Sam leaving with a mysterious man in a black hat, a man who never existed. In September 2018, after insisting for years that she had been duped by Dan and had no knowledge of his crimes, Buffett was convicted on 2 counts of accessory after the fact and sentenced to 32 months in prison. She was released in 2019. On December 16, 2015, after a trial that laid bare every calculated, cold-blooded detail of the murders, a jury found Daniel Wozniak guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances, multiple murders committed for financial gain. On January 11, 2016, the same jury recommended the death penalty. Judge William Froberg formally sentenced Wozniak to death on September 23, 2016. Wozniak showed no remorse. Lead prosecutor Matt Murphy, who had argued passionately for the death penalty, pointed to Wozniak's complete disregard for his victims, their families, and the suffering he had caused. "We are not talking about someone who stole a car stereo," Murphy said. "We are talking about a man who ruthlessly murdered 2 people so he could go on a honeymoon." Daniel Wozniak was initially sent to death row at San Quentin State Prison. In 2019, California Governor Gavin Newsom issued a moratorium on executions across the state, effectively ensuring that Wozniak, like hundreds of other death row inmates, would never face the death chamber. Then, in July 2021, Wozniak was transferred out of San Quentin and moved to Salinas Valley State Prison as part of the Condemned Inmate Transfer Pilot Program, which placed some death row inmates in lower security facilities. The move outraged the families of his victims. Steve Herr, Sam's father, said he learned about it not from prison officials, but from an acquaintance of Wozniak's who ran a blog supporting him. "It was a kick in the gut," Steve said. "If I could, I would kill him myself." The case has been covered extensively on television: Dateline, 2020, Dr. Phil, Lockup, each retelling the story of the aspiring actor who killed two innocent people for a honeymoon he would never take. Sam Herr's best friend, a fellow veteran named Miles Foltz, asked Steve Herr to serve as best man at his wedding in Sam's place. Steve accepted the honor. Eddie June Kibuishi, Julie's mother, commissioned a memorial quilt woven with images of her daughter's love of music and fashion, a tribute to a young woman described by everyone who knew her as full of sunlight and beauty. Daniel Wozniak is 40 years old now. He remains incarcerated, his automatic appeal to the California Supreme Court still pending. And somewhere in a theater archive in Orange County, there is footage of him performing on stage in 9 on May 21st, 2010, singing, dancing, taking his bows, just hours after committing a murder that would destroy two families and prove that sometimes the most dangerous performance is the one no one sees coming.